On today's episode of What Did I Impulse Buy Now? The swap meet acquisition sickness strikes again. So adding another chainsaw to the fleet is not something we really needed, but how can you pass this thing up? A project like this is just begging to be cleaned up and reconditioned and, put back into service. Oh yeah, that's some fresh gas right there. Now in a case like this, there's a good chance you might be able to just throw some fuel in here, yank that cord about 50 times, and it might pop off and spark to life. But you'll most likely be disappointed with the run quality. It probably won't run very long before one of the fuel lines breaks or one of the diaphragms in the carburetor springs a leak. So, we're just going to start fresh, start rehabbing this thing from the ground up and see if we can't make it back to its former glory. Not bad at all. Well, let me take that back a second. There's no air filter in there. Not sure if a squirrel was chewing on that carburetor. This comes apart somehow. We're just going with the random technique of loosening every fastener, and eventually it ought to fall apart. Wow, look at that muffler. Almost no rust at all. So I gotta say, compared to some of those little mini Macs and some of the other micro chainsaws I've worked on, this thing is actually coming apart really easy. I mean, thus far, we haven't spent more than a few minutes here and she's about cleaned out. I can't believe the lack of rust on that muffler. This saw must have very low hours on it. I'm gonna guess, if that is the date, this is either a 77, 78, maybe a 79 model chainsaw. I am surprised though that this whole top portion here is made out of plastic. The side cover and stuff's made out of aluminum. However, I guess they were trying to save weight. I'm surprised back then that they were actually making this much out of plastic. Same with the top cover. Now this is about as close as we're going to get to a restoration. Yeah, we'll just let that soak in for a while. An added benefit is that the workbench gets cleaned. I don't know, that's too much shine. Now, I thought about painting the bar, but then I came to my senses and we just hit it with a Scotch-Brite pad and we're going to call that good enough. Just deburred a little bit because apparently somebody was forgetting to add oil. Well, that spark plug is looking a little bit afoul. I don't know if I have an extra one of these around, so we're just going to rehab it. We're not going to replace it. So the proper way to defoul a plug is to first get your torch and then drop it on the floor. So that way your gap goes to 0. Then you burn the heck out of it. So once you get that thing flaming like the space shuttle upon re-entry, it's done. You got to keep them made in USA plugs going. So like I said, we're not even waiting to try this thing. We're just tearing into the carb right now. So we finally broke that cap off. And as you can see, there's definitely some grunge in there and some old, rancid oil. Wouldn't hurt to take all this thing apart and clean it all out. So if you're crafty with a razor blade, sometimes you can save these gaskets. Now this is a rare occasion where the diaphragm is still pretty soft and pliable, and I think we can reuse it. But this carburetor hadn't been apart for decades. Everything was stuck. It took a lot of force to break it free. And once you finally did get in there, look at all the remnants of gunk and stuff. And oftentimes, this is where a piece of old equipment will get a bad rap, you know? If you tried to run this, I think it actually would have ran as is. However, all this junk, you know, and some of the bad fuel lines and other stuff in here, it wouldn't have been very reliable long term. You'd have had issues eventually. However, with a little bit of preventive maintenance, maybe a few dollars in parts, you can get this back up to spec. Which brings me to the sidetrack of the day. This thing. Now don't worry, I didn't buy this. I'm working on it for a friend. And as you can tell, it's kind of late model, which is not my style, but you know, we never turn down a challenge. We'll work on anything. And this little I right here stands for I hate my life when I have to work on something like this. Because this is one of those fancy fuel injected chainsaws. Well, chop saw. Now this saw is only a few years old. However, it was in the shop because it wouldn't run right and it didn't have any power and wouldn't rev up and stuff. And the guy took it into an actual steel shop and they said that there was some type of a sensor or fuel I don't even know what it was, but it was going to cost $700 to replace the parts and fix it. Now, that is absurd with a pretty new saw costing like over half the amount it would take to replace it brand new, just with a few parts. And yes, carburetors can be a pain, they're more maintenance intensive, but I would rather take a $20 rebuild kit in one of these over $700 any day. And I'm sure it's not the norm that these things fail and that they're pretty reliable, but you know, it really sucks when you do get a bad one and there's no cheap way to actually fix it. So I had this engine cover off. I was looking at the computer ECM in there, all the wiring. I had to give up on trying to diagnose anything electronic because I don't have the actual code readers or electronic diagnostic tools. So as a last ditch effort, we went back to the basics. Took most of this off, cleaned the air filter. It was pretty dirty. Made sure all the electrical connections were right. You know, checked the fuel lines. Nothing amiss there. Dumped out the gas, put some fresh stuff in with a little bit of seafoam, and we fired it up and gave it a test run. And like it did before, it had no power, it wouldn't rev up, it would just bog down. But I kept working it and running it, and it was sort of kind of running, so then I shut it down and let it sit, you know. Let that seafoam do its thing. Fired it up a couple of days later, and it was still running the same. Boy, was it smoking a lot. You know, it didn't help that I have like 30-to-1 oil ratio in there. But we ran it, and ran it, and ran it, and eventually it actually started coming around and running better. You could see on the spark arrestor screen, you know, when I got it, it was pretty black and carboned up. But once it started running pretty good, we gave it the old Italian tune-up and just ran the heck out of this thing. And wouldn't you believe it, it actually came around and started running pretty well. And I've ran it twice since then, after it's cooled down completely, and it's still running half decent. Now I gotta knock on wood somewhere. If it was just potentially a fouled out sensor, or something that's partially plugged up, or who knows what was going on with that Houdini electrical system. But after we was done running, you could see that the exhaust was burning clean, and all that carbon that was in there was burned off. I mean, I had almost written off even trying to work on one of these saws because it was out of my league as far as the electronics went. It never hurts to check a lot of the basics and, you know, try and keep it simple when you're diagnosing stuff. Now, one thing to consider if you're, you know, in the fuel tank and you're trying to reuse the filter that's in there. Now, this lead filter looked alright from the outside, but once you get to the inside, it's all plugged up. So we got some secondhand fuel line in the fuel tank, and we'll give the chain a quick tune-up. A homemade air filter, that'll do the job. It definitely cleaned up pretty nice. Gotta love that lime radiation green on there. That's the perfect little cover. I mean, we'll see if it runs half as good as it looks, you know, but by my standards, that thing's pretty mint. Now, this was purchased a while ago. I think for the princely sum of either $10 or $20. I can't really remember. I mean, that was back in the day when, you know, swap meets were still a thing. Alright, so we got some good fuel in there. See if we can get this thing to fire up. It's definitely got good compression. Maybe some half choke. This is going to be a finicky one. We'll try the actual instructions. It says to start it like this. I never like doing that. Yeah, we might have to try and raise the idle up a little bit. Now we're going to richen up the low speed there. That might be why she's kind of dying out. So the next time you see some haggard old piece of equipment and you're like, wow, man, that thing's been around the block a time or two. How many things built today are still going to be going 40 years later? They literally don't build them like that anymore. Everybody needs a junk drawer. That's just where all your random acquirements and bits and pieces end up. And when you're done working on the table, you just kind of sweep it into there and call it a day.